This is the Best Health Podcast, brought to you by Wake Forest Baptist Health in partnership with MedCost.
Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode of the Best Health Podcast, brought to you by Wake Forest Baptist Health. This is Justin Gomez joining you once again. Thank you all for listening to our podcast and being loyal listeners. Or if you're a first-time listener, you picked a great podcast to jump on and join for your first time. This is part of the series that we're continuing that are COVID-19 coronavirus-related podcasts. And before I dive too far quickly into this podcast topic for today, which we're going to be looking at the cosmology of coronavirus, which I think is very interesting. And we have a great guest to talk about that today. But I do want to let everyone know at the top of this episode, you have a couple of really good resources. If you need more information about COVID-19, you can call our Wake Forest Baptist Health hotline at 336-70-COVID, 336-70-COVID, and that's manned 24/7. And you can also visit wakehealth.edu/coronavirus, wakehealth.edu/coronavirus. All kinds of good information, resources on there, FAQs, clinic updates, visitor restriction updates. There's a self-assessment tool that you can take. So all the podcasts that we've done that are coronavirus related are also listed on there. So invite you all to check that out as well. I did want to go ahead and get started with our guest today, Dr. Afrayem Morgan. He's a third-year psychiatry resident here at Wake Forest Baptist Health. Welcome, Dr. Morgan. How are you, sir?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me, Justin.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for taking time out and chatting with us today. So we're going to dive into the cosmology of coronavirus here in a minute. But before we do, if you wouldn't mind just telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got into psychiatry.
Of course. Well, like you said, I'm a third-year psychiatry resident. It's a 4-year residency program. How I got into psychiatry, long story, but the short version of it was until my last maybe year or two in medical school overseas, I was interested in more of the surgical specialties. That was back in Egypt, where I'm from, where I grew up. I was part of a lot of the social upheaval that happened back there in the Arab Spring, and that essentially shifted my interest initially towards psychology, and that segued into clinical psychiatry, of course, and then a lot of theory of mind and why people disagree about stuff, why people perceive things the way they do, despite the incidents and circumstances probably being the same, but people react very differently. So that was the general change in my direction.
Interesting. Well, that's really cool. I'm glad that you're here at Wake Forest Baptist working with us.
Thank you.
I'm just going to kind of jump in at a very basic foundational level. If you wouldn't mind explaining for all of us listening, what is cosmology? Just kind of give us a brief overview of what cosmology is and why we should pay attention to it.
Yes, so cosmology, the term from a physical sciences perspective is the study of the universe or the cosmos, the physical study of that. And the philosophical interpretation of that is how the universe as a whole relates to life in it and how life in the universe relates to it. And that includes us as humans. So cosmology is how do we as humans relate to the universe around us and everything that is in the universe in a relational way.
Very interesting. So how does the COVID-19 pandemic fit into all of this? It's kind of taken over our lives seemingly in some way, one way or the other, the last little bit here and caused us to change our day-to-day life structure and schedules. And, from your perspective, how do you think COVID-19 fits into the cosmology?
Well, with it being, like you said, something that has taken over our lives, coronavirus or COVID-19 now is not only a term you hear in a microbiology class. It is definitely something that has been affecting each and every one of us, not just at an intellectual level, on a very personal level. It affects how we move about day to day, how we interact with other people, how it affects our jobs. It's like you said, it's affecting everything. So in that sense, it is core to how we conceptualize our relationship with our universe. Hence the cosmology of coronavirus.
Okay. So, kind of looking at your normal cosmology studying and way of looking at things, and then tying that into COVID-19, what inspired relating COVID-19 into overall cosmology?
I think the starting point for me, initially it was the personal question for me. How do I relate to this? How am I going to move around with this new factor in my life? Like all the changes that are happening in my life because of coronavirus. And then it expanded a little bit to, well, how can I be useful in my position as a psychiatry resident working mostly in outpatient clinical settings? How can I be useful for my patients and for people around me in interacting with this? People are suffering, people are having different kinds of hardships, be it physical health or financial or emotional. How can I help myself and others relate to this in a wholesome, healthy way?
So that's a good point. How can we relate to this and provide some, I guess, positive contribution to the cosmos, instead of contributing the opposite of that. Looking at that, and I was reading a little bit of what you wrote online, and you are so after the stockpiled toilet paper has been used up and the masks and gowns have been discarded, we'll have time, the luxury of drawing profound insights and life lessons from this pandemic. What, I guess, expand a little bit on that. What do you thinking we're going to be able to sit down and look into from an insightful perspective, and what life lessons? I've heard several people out in the news media and on social media talk about, well, this was, we didn't want coronavirus, we didn't want COVID-19. Obviously, we didn't want this huge disruption in our lives, but because of this situation that I'm in, I found myself being able to do this, or I had the opportunity to do that, where I normally wouldn't be able to. So I guess if you wouldn't mind just talking about maybe, if we could think about after we get past this crisis time that we're in now, what types of insights or life lessons do you think we would learn from the pandemic?
Of course, and I'd like to take a step a little bit even before that, even before jumping into when the pandemic is over. I would like to touch on, well, what about now?
Yeah.
And I want to do this very cautiously because I do not want to fall into the trap of what some may call toxic positivity.
Okay.
I definitely want to be very mindful and aware of that. I do not think that right now is the time to speak, for example, about the silver lining of a pandemic. I can't speak of a silver lining when folks are losing jobs, losing financial security, or losing loved ones to illness or to death. So I want to almost put out a disclaimer that I come from a place of acknowledging the suffering. I don't want to minimize it. I don't want to sugarcoat it in any way. And because this suffering is very real, and because a lot of it is unavoidable and inevitable for most of us, Like I said, ranging the spectrum up from financial difficulty or financial suffering all the way to physical and health. I come from a place of what psychiatrist Viktor Frankl described as logotherapy, where he speaks about inevitable suffering. Like, what can we do when suffering is established to be inevitable and avoidable? Well, what's next? And he's the one that said when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And he also says, if there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be meaning in suffering. And that's an acknowledgement of suffering is an unavoidable part of life.
Yeah, interesting.
And to put in context, Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he said those words after he made it through the Holocaust. That's why it has a lot of value.
Gotcha. Looking at that from that context, is this one where you're able to recontextualize? Maybe some people have that luxury and some people don't. I mean, if you're from a socioeconomic standpoint or physically healthy, if you have underlying health conditions, does it change the way that you contextualize or are able to contextualize COVID-19 in the grasp of the larger cosmos?
I would say yes, because like you said, there's so many different layers and levels to it. It would be very pretentious of me to say that I have a quick WikiHow of how to do it. But I think it does matter to reconceptualize our relationship to the illness itself. If we acknowledge, for example, that nature by definition is not out to get us, that relieves some of the perceived threat that one might think of just venturing out. That is one starting point. Nature is not our enemy. Nature is not your enemy. That is out to get you.
So, I mean, I guess taking that approach, how can we translate that into kind of practical day-to-day use that's going to help us, if we can't sit down and kind of take a large, retrospective at the cosmos and how we fit into the universe. If we just take the COVID-19 context of the universe right now, how does approaching it that way, where it's part of a larger system that exists, there's can you talk about maybe how that can help us in our day-to-day lives?
Yes, and that's my favorite part, honestly, to bring it down to earth from fancy elitist talk to real life. Well, how does this translate to everyday? I think everybody that's talking about COVID has started out talking about minimizing the inundation of data and information that we expose ourselves to.
Yeah.
That is a huge piece, and that's definitely the starting point. There's a big difference between getting facts or information and getting opinions or emotional responses to what some people think are facts and data. So one place to start, and this cannot be repeated enough, is to control what you're exposing yourself to from an information perspective. Pick one or two sources of information, good objective websites. They don't have to be news outlets. Just pick one or two good resources. Keep an eye on that, and that's the extent of it. Our minds can only tolerate the word crisis or disaster flashing on screens so many times a day. So that's definitely a place to start out, and trying to make the most of the little space that we have now that most of us are in one way or another confined to a narrow space.
Yeah.
I like to emphasize rediscovering our relationship with nature. like I said earlier, nature is not an enemy. I can't emphasize that enough to rejuvenate that connection with physical nature around us. Doesn't mean you have to go on a hike. Just exploring what is in your neighborhood, what is blooming outside, what kind of birds are you listening to, and that's not some hippie fluff. There actually is a strong connection at the biological level between 20 to 30 minutes roughly a day in nature and the relief of the biological markers of stress in our bodies. Fortunately, spring is happening outside, so that's a good incentive to do that. Another thing about the relational component, because just like COVID has affected our perception of our relationship with nature, it's also affected our relationships with other people.
Yeah.
I think walking around in a grocery store now, the tension is almost palpable when two people are walking next to each other.
Yeah.
And that's going to linger after this is over. But for now, let's be mindful of rejuvenating that connection with other persons around us. Maybe our physical interactions are limited for now, but we have options of telephone communications, of video communications. Make a point of communicating with at least 2 or 3 people a day. Try to plan group video calls, but also decide how often you want to do that. Again, the same idea of controlling what you're inundated with. Figure out that right balance for you, but be mindful and intentional with that connection with other people. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So, Dr. Morgan, maybe hard for people to say, okay, let me approach it from a universe-wide standpoint. Let me find where I am in the universe. Let me find where COVID-19 is in the universe, where my family is in the universe. And, it's interesting that we have, I can hear one piece of information and you can hear the same piece of information, yet it's interpreted very differently between us, right? So True. I wonder if the same principle applies if you kind of take a cosmology look at things. Is if I'm looking at where I stand in the universe, where COVID-19 stands in the universe, my daily interactions are so small compared to how massive the universe is, right? And same thing with you. So is that okay that we have kind of different perceptions of where we are as far as where we are in the universe and where COVID-19 is in the universe and how we're interpreted things? Is there some sort of universal law that we all should be paying attention to, or is it okay for us to interpret things differently?
Oh, it's not only okay that we interpret the universe differently. I think it's essential. Otherwise, we would be just boring clones of each other. Part of the beauty of life is all these different perspectives that we get. But it does matter. Like, why does this whole perspective and relational piece matter? Because a big component of our struggles and even of our well-being is not only what happens to me, but my relationship to what happens to me, my perception of what happens to me. And again, that's not hippie fluff. This is a core tenet of a lot of psychotherapy approaches. That's why we have approaches like choice theory, radical acceptance and commitment therapy. All of these are framed around a starting point of very difficult, mostly unavoidable external circumstances. And then we have these approaches of, okay, well, how can I relate to them? How can I conceptualize them in a way that is conducive to my well-being and to me being the best me I can be given the circumstances?
Okay. So I guess to take that a step further, your area of specialty is psychiatry and dealing with the mind, which is, we can spend hours and hours just talking about how we theorize the mind is structured, and how complex it can be. But, looking at the person, the kind of the mind, body, spirit approach, How does that fit into the idea of cosmology and where we're able to control what we can in our universe and where we can't control things from a kind of a mind, body, spirit perspective?
Again, it all comes back to the, I hate to sound cliche, but say the power of perception, particularly in psychiatric disorders, not exclusively in psychiatric disorders, but particularly in psychiatric disorders. It doesn't only matter what happens to you, but also what you think about what happens to you. And what you think about what happens to you is informed, like you said, by your mind, your intellect, your cognitive structure, and your spirit, whatever that spiritual component is, be it a religious structure or a secular religious approach. That doesn't matter as long as you have a connection or a perception of yourself as part of a whole, not as just a separate, isolated individual.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, Dr. Morgan. This has been really cool. We're wrapping up here for our time at this podcast episode. Not sure if you want to leave us with a closing thought, but as you're thinking, we can definitely provide a link on this podcast to more information about this topic. And if people have just general information or questions rather about this, they can go to wakehealth.edu and search Dr. Morgan. But Dr. Morgan, as we're wrapping up, discussing cosmology and helping us kind of maybe take a step back and study the bigger picture here for a minute. As you go through this personally and you go through this professionally, as a clinician, what's a closing thought that you can leave with us? That's a little nugget that we can remember as we go on from this podcast.
I think the biggest thing I would want to say is please don't isolate and don't give in to the pressures to isolate. Reach out to friends or relatives or clinicians. We're here to help, and we're more than happy to walk with you through this. We're walking through it together.
Well, I think that's a great closing comment, Dr. Morgan. We're walking through this together. So I appreciate your time. This has been really insightful. So I thank you for joining us today. I hope you come back and visit us for another podcast later on at some point.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks for providing this space for me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to all the listeners out there, appreciate you taking the time today to listen to this episode, and feel free to check out our other episodes available wherever you download your podcasts. Just search Best Health or Wake Forest Baptist Health. And until we chat again, I encourage everyone to please be well.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Best Health Podcast, brought to you by Wake Forest Baptist Health. For more wellness info, check out wakehealth.edu/besthealth and follow us on social media. Wake Forest Baptist Health. Care for life.